when I got there, the whole forest had been flattened. It had been logged, and these magnificent, huge trees were gone. And something broke in me at that time. I felt really violated. All of the forests that have been deforested in the world are also storehouses of lots of carbon dioxide, and now those have become carbon dioxide emissions. And globally, 15% of the total emissions that humans have caused is the deforestation story and forest degradation. The remaining 85% is from fossil fuels. If you can't finance your dream, then you only get to be a dreamer. There's a real spectrum of finance. In that Shark Tank, there's a multitude of species, some of which are brutal, ferocious, and some of which are very compassionate. There is good money that can go towards good things. This is what we're really focused on.
Welcome back to Care Beyond Profits. I'm Azura Ali. In this episode, I speak to Dr. Sean Weaver. He is the founder and chief executive at Ekos, and he is a global expert in climate and environmental finance. This episode is special to me because Sean shares his entrepreneurial journey, and he reminds us that money isn't just about profit maximization. Instead, we dive into how money can be a source of good and the theory behind sharks and dolphins in finance. Now, before we dive in, if this speaks to you, please like, share, and subscribe to Care Beyond Profits. Let's get into it. Sean, welcome to the show. It's such a privilege to have you here.
It's great to be here, Azura. Really nice to speak to you.
Thank you, Sean. Before we start into the conversation today, I want to start off with a little bit about your background. So can you tell us, the audience listening in today, a little bit more about Sean, the person without your CV?
Sean, the person without the CV. Well, it's a little bit difficult to differentiate those two at times because a lot of my own identity is connected with the things that I do with work, which is, I suppose, true for a lot of people who are really dedicated to what they do. And also my work is not really a job, it's just a passion. So if I wasn't getting paid, I'd be doing these sorts of things anyway, somehow. But the things that inspire me, the things that I spend time with include my family. You know, I have a lovely wife and two wonderful sons. One's going to be 21 this year, the other one's just turned 18. And a couple of dogs. We live in Christchurch. We've lived in different parts of New Zealand over the years. And I'm originally from Fiji, which is where I was born, and came to New Zealand when I was just turning 4, and was a bit of a jock in high school. I just loved my sport and did many different sports, and was fairly serious with that for that part of my life, and did the usual punishment of the body and injuries, and I'm still paying for some of that now as I get older, but and I've always been interested in spending time in the wilderness and nature, and I just love being in wild places and get a huge sense of satisfaction from that.
And was something there in living in Fiji that started off your beginnings in this?
Well, I was a little bit young. Some of those because I was born there and then came to New Zealand when I was just turning 4. And in those early years, I guess, experiencing an element of Fiji culture, living in a country where you're an ethnic minority was a really good thing to experience. I went back to live in Fiji in my early adulthood, and that was also an extension of being an ethnic minority in a country, and I really recommend it to anyone who isn't an ethnic minority in the country that they currently live, because it opens up your mind and your heart to difference and a more empathic sense towards different cultures and different ways of life and different languages and things. So yeah, that certainly did have an impact. And in Fijian culture is very generous and communal, and I got a lot of that rubbed off onto me. Yeah, and there's also there's an indigenous Fijian culture which I spent a lot of time in and learned to speak the language and was able to be embedded in that culture, lived in villages and things like that, which was wonderful. And there's also an ethnic Indian community in Fiji, which I also spent a lot of time with, have very close friends and family friends, and would go to Indian weddings and be the wedding photographer, and because I was the one with a camera, and That was also really wonderful. So I've had a really rich multicultural experience in my lifetime, especially early in my life.
What made you go back to Fiji?
Well, my family split, so my father stayed there. He's from there, from a colonial family that settled in Fiji, and I had reason to go back and visit my father over the years when I was going through school, and then when I left school and went into university and started studying forest ecology, I wanted to study rainforests, and the nearest rainforest, the most convenient rainforests, were in Fiji because I could go and stay with my dad, and then venture into the highlands and into the interior, um, and work on Fiji rainforests, which is what I did during my postgrad work.
That's really interesting. And can you summarize for us in terms of what you do? Why do you do it, and why is it that you enjoy it so much and you're so passionate about this?
It's a good question. I mean, I've always been fascinated by nature. I've always got a lot of satisfaction from being in quiet places. And there's something about coastlines and rock pools and forests and wild places that give me a sense of wellness. And in some ways, my scientific training helped get me to those places. I guess one of the reasons why I became, an ecologist rather than a physiologist that would do lots of experiments in labs. I didn't really want to be in labs. I wanted to be in the bush. And so I took a subject line that would take me to wild and wonderful places. So yeah, that's got something to do with it. Also, when I was doing my postgrad work in Fiji, I was studying a magnificent rainforest, and I got to know it really well. I was doing surveys, and I even got to know individual trees. And one time, a guide that I worked with very closely had found a cinnamon tree, a tree from the cinnamon genus Cinnamonum, and they sent this Fijian guy, and they use it to scent their coconut oil, for putting on your body. And so he stripped some bark off the cinnamon tree, and the tree wasn't very big, and I was a bit worried about its well-being as a tree. And so when I went back to that forest a few months later, and one day I thought, I'm going to check on this tree to make sure it's doing all right. But when I got there, the whole forest had been flattened. It had been logged, and these magnificent, huge trees were gone. And I would stand on these tree trunks and just look at the bright sky when previously, I'd been spending time in this just amazing place. And something broke in me at that time. I felt really violated. It was a very private experience. I was there that day on my own, so I couldn't really share it with anyone. And I'm not sure I could share it anyway, because it was just a sense of comprehensive violation. The landowners hadn't consented to the forest being logged, and so there's the added element of an injustice to those local communities who now didn't have clean water. They didn't have running water. They had the river, but now the river was all filled with sediment, and it was just a catastrophe, and that deeply saddened me, and it was a key turning point, really, where something inside me said, I'm going to try and stop this happening. And I've been doing that ever since.
And why does it matter so much?
I mean, there's all sorts of scientific answers to that. Forests are like factories that produce ecosystem services, a range of benefits, soil conservation, flood protection, climate resilience, biodiversity, pharmaceuticals, medicinal plants, wood. All of the forests that have been deforested in the world are also storehouses of lots of carbon dioxide, and now those have become carbon dioxide emissions. And globally, about 15% of the total emissions that humans have caused is from forests, is the deforestation story and forest degradation. The remaining 85% is from fossil fuels, 80% or slightly more. So it's a really significant proportion of the big picture of climate change. And also when we remove forests, we lose the the benefits that they deliver in terms of climate resilience and flood protection and drought protection. Forest soils are like a sponge that carries a lot of water, and they can drip feed streams during droughts, and so the water supply is really good and clean. But you take away the forest and the soil dries out, and all of that rainfall that is distributed across the year can't accumulate in the soil, and we lose access to water. So these are kind of utility reasons to be concerned about forests being destroyed. But then there's also that emotional connection with place and identity and landscape. When I was in high school, I was studying science, but I also really loved English literature. And my English teacher, he handed me a book by Henry David Thoreau, who's an American naturalist from the 19th century, who wrote about the intimacy of connection with place. And that just sparked a lifelong passion for the emotional, artistic connection, life as a work of art, and engaging with place as a way of life rather than just as a set of utilities. And to this day, my work and my life is an interweaving of the aesthetic, the spiritual, the personal, the intimate, with the scientific and the economic and the financial. So it's a blend of those things, and I think that's probably where it came from, those early experiences. And I still feel violated when rivers are polluted, and it disgusts me.
You spoke about the connection to the spiritual in terms of what you're practicing on a daily basis. What does that look like? Where do you take in your energy from?
Well, I find, my cathedrals have been forests. Like, I get an immense sense of indescribable wellness from being in natural places. And early in my life, as a mid and late teenager, nature essentially was my religion. And then since that time, I've discovered certain types of practices that agree with that. And one of them is Zen Buddhism. And so I got interested in Zen in my early adulthood, started reading about it as a teenager in high school, and then started practicing and going to meditation retreats and things, and then became a Zen student formally about 35 years ago, 30 to 35 years ago. And I've since become a really strong practitioner of Zen, which is it's a practice that is about quietening the voice of the mind so that we can hear and experience more intimately what is going on. And out of that comes a love for nature and people, and so Zen is my practice. So I'm part of a group that we have here in New Zealand. Here in Christchurch, we have a sitting group. We meet on Tuesday evenings, and we sit in the mornings, each morning online together, people from different parts of the country, and we sit from sort of 6:15 till 6:45, just for half an hour. And but then that's the Tuesday nights, and then I go to meditation retreats a couple of times a year for 5 days or 7 days, depending on which one it is. And I find that stillness really, really valuable, because even though the stillness and the quietness is just a quietness of language, but it's not a stillness or quietness of everything else, which isn't language, which is everything we see and smell and taste and feel and and smell, and that gets really vivid. And then taking that into a forest is, it's magnificent.
Was there a certain point in your life that you started to explore this more? Was there any triggers in your life that made you go down this pathway?
I just had a great thirst for it as a teenager. It seemed to me that the world of utilitarian selfishness wasn't the full story, and it was silent on a whole lot of things that were intuitively really important to me. But as a teenager, it's very hard to get that validated. But as a young adult, I started to read more and explore more and then go to groups and then, as I say, go to meditation retreats and things, and that started to validate this sense. And a lot of it is connected to how we want to be in the world, how we want to behave, what kind of relationships we want to have, and how do we want to conduct ourselves in those relationships. And even when it's responding to some terrible environmental situation, I got exhausted from being really, really angry about deforestation and environmental degradation, the pollution of rivers and air pollution, and the climate, the challenges with the climate system, and getting enraged by that is probably quite a natural response to really understanding what's happening. And this also applies to things like injustices towards people and war and genocide and domination and things. And to get angry is a natural response, but I've found that it's not a very useful response, and it's also something that I couldn't sustain.
Thanks, Sean. And can you tell us a bit more about Ekos and what you're building?
The name Ekos comes from the ancient Greek word oikos, which is the common ancestor of the modern word ecology, but also the modern word economy. They both come from the same root word, oikos, which means house and home, kind of like family, connection, interactions, transactions. And so ecos is a marriage of ecology and economics, where ecology and a sense of emotional connection with the earth is the why, and the economics is the how. Because I also realised that if you can't finance your dream, then you only get to be a dreamer. And I didn't want to be a dreamer. I wanted to help bend the course of history for the better, and that needed to be resourced both emotionally, in ways I described before, in terms of being able to endure this and sustain this effort in a very hopeful sort of way, but also financially. So looking after the place, protecting a forest or growing a new forest or protecting a waterway, this requires effort, and that effort, often we'll do things as a volunteer, but if we want to do things at any meaningful scale, it can't just rely on voluntary effort. It needs to be paid for, and this is why we need to finance the dream. And so ECOS is all about environmental financing, and that's why we work in a range of different forms of financing. One form is grant funding and donations, but we don't focus on that. Plenty of other people do, and the majority of conservation movement is financed that way. But I learned that the scale of the problem, both in New Zealand and globally, of climate change, of biodiversity loss, is orders of magnitude larger than the amount of money available in taxpayers' pockets or in the pockets of philanthropy. It's so much larger than that there has to be another source of money if we are going to be realistic about solving the climate crisis and building resilience to climate change and adapting to it, and also to solve the biodiversity crisis. And the source of money, which is much larger and has more than enough to do this job, is the private sector. And so that's why I got involved in market-based mechanisms. And I remember when I was doing some work for the government of Vanuatu, helping negotiate on their behalf at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it was around 2006, and the world was trying to figure out how to fund global forest protection and reforestation. And the global UN community part of it was focused on essentially grant funding as the solution, and another part of that community was talking about carbon markets. And I was wondering, well, why carbon markets? And I asked a friend of mine who had a finance career, and he said, well, Sean, the question that's worth asking is, where's the money going to come from? If it's from governments and from philanthropy, well, it's basically from taxpayers. Whereas if it's in markets, then it can come from the private sector, which is a much larger community financially. I think the global financing gap for biodiversity conservation is about almost $1 trillion a year. And that's way more than the global governments and philanthropists can afford. But the global fund management sector is managing about $145 trillion a year this year, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers. So there's more than enough money in the private sector. So the challenge is how to get access to that money. And I guess what we're trying to do at Ekos is unlock a fire hose of money from the private sector and point it at the places in the world that need it. And we're focused on climate change and biodiversity is the main thing that we're focused on. We're also focused on community and the UN Sustainable Development Goals and well-being and no poverty, no hunger in an integrated sort of approach. But it's that fire hose of money that we're trying to open and learning how to access that kind of money without destroying your value set, because big money can come with big hooks. It has a culture of its own, the finance community. And that's not the same culture as the philanthropic community. They want to look after the planet and look after people. And yet if we want to unlock the fire hose of money, there needs to be some kind of reconciliation between those worlds. And that's where we focus our work, is to train community projects to become business versions of that community conservation or community philanthropic effort without losing the value set that brought them to this in the first place, and also invite the money to not impose so much risk on those local communities, sort of kind up the money, to take the sharp edges off it, because raising large volumes of capital in the shark tank means you got to learn how to swim with sharks or become one, or identify dolphins and be able to differentiate between sharks and dolphins. And so that's really what we're trying to do, is find the dolphins in the finance world and work with them and help them connect with communities and community projects that are able to speak the language of the dolphin. Because I've seen many occasions where community organisations have spoke the language of sharks, and they've gone and got built a financial relationship with a shark, but it doesn't tend to end well for the project for reasons which we can explore. But the thing that I did learn is that there's a real spectrum of finance. That in that shark tank there's a multitude of species, some of which are brutal and ferocious, and some of which are very compassionate, and a range in between. And that was a wonderful discovery, because it brought me lots of hope that actually, this can work. There is good money that can go towards good things. And this is what we're really focused on.
And how are you finding your dolphins? For those who are listening and wondering about this, what was your approach? How did you get started with that, and what led you to some of your successes?
Yeah, it was a learn as you go type exercise. I mean, sometimes I thought I was meeting with a dolphin and they turned out to be a shark. And it's part of it is a willingness to walk away, and a willingness to not take just any money, and a willingness to understand really what are the terms and conditions of that money. To what extent does this person or this organization want to control you and control how you behave and operate, or to what extent they are values aligned and agree with you that there's a crisis, and agree with you that the way to fund our way out of it is not just to maximize profit, right, but to at least break even and turn a profit, but not super profits. And so I've learned to make it really clear to whoever I'm talking to, and at the early stages you don't know if they're sharks or dolphins, you can just see the fin, is to make it clear that we're not here to deliver super profits, and it's not, the profit isn't the purpose. We need to make a profit, because without that we will go insolvent. The projects would go bust. We need to at least break even and have some spare, so that's a profit. But we're not about profit maximization. And and we're interested in working with people who want a justifiable return, but who are willing to take on some risk. I mean, even today I was meeting with a bank and having the same conversation I'm having with you here, saying, well, you as a bank might want to minimize your risk in potentially investing in this project or program, and you've got infrastructure and you've got protocols around minimizing your financial risk. But don't forget, I've taken on risk. I've invested a lot of my time and money into getting this project investment ready. It's just an investment, and I've taken that risk personally. So I'm inviting you to match me. Because if I'm not prepared to take on risk, how should I expect anyone else to? Mm-hmm. And I've shown them how much risk I've taken. They go, oh yeah, that's fair enough. That is risk. And I've also reminded them, and this is also what I do, is I say, look, there's either a climate crisis or there isn't. And if you think there is one, then there's a bigger risk at play. The risk of not fixing it, the risk of not reducing its impact, because it will do an awful lot of damage to our economy and to all of the people who pay mortgages and people who have debt in your bank. So you as a bank, if I'm talking to a bank, they'll say you're exposed to climate risk. And so you do need to also invest in these climate solutions as a strategic systems level investment. And I'd say the same to the insurance sector and other financial institutions. And it's taken me a long time to get comfortable speaking that language to that audience. And I've taken a lot of knocks and making a lot of mistakes in my time. But I'm a lot more comfortable now calling a spade in that finance world. And, and then through that, you find people who are willing to take that risk. And so you might meet a corporate who says, yeah, well, we're prepared to not make a profit maximization approach to spending $20 million. And because we make it clear to them from the beginning that it's not about profit maximization. And if they're still in the room and in the conversation after a day, a week, a month, and then they invite you to submit an application or a proposal, and then they consider that proposal, and then you show them that there's no maximization of profit here. In fact, it might be just a little bit better than break even. And then they go, yeah, we're in. And then you've got 5 years of project development, $20 million to spend, and reforesting a few thousand hectares, So that's living proof that kind money exists. And especially if you steer it and guide it with assertive and with assertiveness, and also with realistic proposals that are meaningful to those people in their language. When I was younger, I used to sort of feel that all the business people in the world should learn my language as an ecologist. That they should go out and do a master's in ecology. And then at one stage I thought, no, look, if I was in Pakistan, I should probably learn how to speak Urdu, And if I was in China, maybe I should speak Mandarin. And so if I'm going to their world, maybe I need to learn to speak their language. And so that's why I decided to learn how to speak finance, which to me is just another form of ecology. It's just, it's like the human ecosystem.
Absolutely, and that's a beautiful way that you've described that. You spoke a lot about values there, and I just want to dig a little bit deeper into that, because for people that are trying to lead with care, purpose, and also get out there in the marketplace, there's a lot of conflicts that goes on. So can you just explain to us a little bit more on when you are in a position when you have a clash between investments and values, how do you navigate that in your own head?
The way that I do it personally is to never throw my values in the wastebasket and be prepared to walk away. So, and I've done that many, many times. There's been many occasions when I could have taken on a deal that wouldn't have worked for me emotionally. So being willing to walk away is important. But also learn to be I've educated myself around, what's possible. Some things, if we want to get commercial money, we at least need to give the commercial actor a return on that investment. And even if it's a really low return, it still needs to be a return. And I need to show them that the return is possible. And so I need to produce a discounted cash flow, and I need to show them what the internal rate of return projections are and the net present value of their money, and when they can exit the project and the liquidity and those sorts of things. And in doing that, I can understand from a project design perspective what kind of design of project could work in terms of getting access to this kind of money. A good example would be native reforestation in New Zealand, funded by the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, say through selling carbon credits. And I entered that space just to do native reforestation. I'd already been working for about 10 years in the international voluntary carbon market and rainforest protection projects in Fiji, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands. And then I thought, well, let's do some work closer to home. And then when I started to run business models on native reforestation, I found that it never broke even. In fact, quite a long way from breaking even. And if a project will never deliver a financial return, then the investor's just not going to lend you their money to build the project. Even if you can, after you build the project, sell the carbon credits, but if the volume that you generate each year at the price that you can sell them at, if that's not enough to pay back your debt, and if the debt provider can see that in advance, they're just not going to give you that debt. It's a wee bit like going to a bank and asking for a mortgage for your house when you don't have a job, or when you have a job but it doesn't pay enough to service your annual mortgage payments. And they're just going to say, look, we're not going to give you this mortgage because we can't see ourselves getting our money back. And in that situation, I found that a really insightful period of learning, because it helped me understand, okay, I either need to go do something else or get a different source of money. And if the different source of money is grant funding, but there's not enough of that anyway, then maybe give up and do something else. Or I need to innovate and do something which might not be perfect, but is the next best thing. And I wanted to still contribute to the climate solution and biodiversity conservation and plant native forests, but I found that native forests on their own, they're like children in the economy. They're wonderful, they're incredibly valuable, but they don't pay for themselves. And so I needed to bring a grown-up into the financial equation, and I needed to consider planting exotic trees, not only exotic trees, but to plant some of them in the business model, not necessarily in the same place as where the natives were planted, but just so that they're there, so that they could lift the financial performance of the overall project. And if it wasn't exotic trees, I'd just have to have something else in the investment model to lift the financial performance overall. And maybe it might be an investment in housing or stocks or something. Either way, there needed to be something that would lift the overall performance to help essentially subsidize the native portion. So at Ekos, we elected to try planting exotic species in parts of the model, maybe in a different location, so that we could fund the native plantings. And we found that those business models did stack up, they did work. And that allowed us to actually plant native forests using private sector money. But in addition to that, we thought, well, what will happen to these exotic forests? Let's manage them in the most sustainable way possible. So let's never clear fell. Let's do continuous cover, sustainable forest management, which is globally the best type of forest management. So whenever you get sustainably certified paper, it's come from projects that are typically, well, ideally, it's from forests that are never clear cut, and it's sustainable forest management. So we do that in the exotic portion. And then what we also do is, wherever we can and wherever the landowner is interested in doing this, is when we remove some of the exotic trees and harvest them for the timber, and we replant them with natives. And then each time there's a harvest cycle, a small-scale harvest cycle, as there are, you just patches in the forest, a small-scale harvest cycle, then you keep replanting with natives. And then over the longer term, you end up with a native forest, even when it started off being an exotic forest. So we know that that model works, and we've managed to unlock significant volumes of money to do that. And that way we can get the native forests in the short term, because we planted some exotics, and then we also get native forest in the long term because of the way the exotics are managed. So that's an example of bringing together the hard edges of finance with the hard edges of what works from an ecological perspective, and using finance and ecology to co-design a solution that is a blend of the two. Because I find that if it's just finance, you probably wouldn't plant any natives. And if it's just ecology, then it won't break even financially.
And that's such a beautiful way to look at it, because you're looking at it through the strategy lens as well as the finance lens. And what are the main bottlenecks that you've had in pursuing this?
I guess one of the bottlenecks is getting access to larger volumes of capital to do a bigger and better job over a bigger area. As an example, just the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, they would like to convert about 300,000 hectares of really marginal farmland into permanent forest. It's on private land, but that's a solution that they'd like to get to, because they know that those hillsides are really vulnerable to cyclone damage and flooding and, you know, monstrous volumes of sediment ending up in people's kitchens. And, you know, because an awful lot of the sedimentation that comes from extreme weather events is also from farming. It's not just from forestry. And 300,000 hectares of reforestation into permanent forests, that's a big area. That's going to require billions of dollars of investment. It's, you know, many billions, and it's way more than taxpayers can afford. It is within the realms of what private investors can afford, but in order to do that, you're going to have to give them a return on investment. But also, you know, you need to be sufficiently investment ready for them to look at the proposal and say, yeah, we're prepared to put in the first 100 million. So to get investment ready at that, to get that first 100 million, you need to prove that you can well manage 20 or 30 million or 40 million. You've got to prove operational capability and prove that you've got the financial discipline to do it. You've got to prove it commercially. And so through time, over the last sort of 6 years or so, we've been building proof of concept with that 20 million or 30 million, so that we can then offer a bigger option to a bigger investor. Now, these bigger investors are already operating in New Zealand in the emissions trading scheme, for example, but not in the nature-centric way. You know, it's more just in the maximise profit sort of way, and just straight exotic forests and clear-cut forestry. Sometimes it's not clear-cut forestry, but so that money is in the country, but we don't see it doing as good a job as it could do in sensitive landscapes. We want to do this in such a way that it's good for the local communities and local farmers, so that they can keep the family farm, rather than the investment just buying all of this land and depopulating Hawke's Bay, rural Hawke's Bay, so that the local schools shut down because there's a lack of students, and the local voluntary fire service shuts down because there's no parents to, you know, be part of that voluntary fire service, and the local pub closes down, and, you know, the local communities just go into decline and decay. And this happens when projects and investments aren't thinking broadly enough and are not thinking in terms of people and communities and things beyond the boundary of the investment and the impact it can have. And some of the money that is coming into big scale forest carbon projects is the kind of projects that are causing a lot of concern among rural New Zealanders around, you know, depopulating the rural landscape, because instead of it being farmed and employing farmers and farm workers, it's now forest, pine forest everywhere, and less people might live on the land. So the local school closes down for lack of students, and the local pub closes down for lack of patrons, and the local voluntary fire service can't operate because there's a ghost town. So we don't want that either, and we want to build a type of investment model that solves those problems as well, or doesn't cause another social problem, right? And I think investments and types of development will often solve one problem and cause a series of others when they've been poorly designed, when they haven't been designed from a systems perspective and haven't been designed by looking at whole landscapes and whole communities. And this is where the whole perspective of regenerative forestry comes in. As regenerative forestry is a systems approach to tree management and land management that includes communities, it includes a range of different factors which are typically not considered by types of money that just want to maximize profit. Because if you consider these broader factors, well, the project's going to be more expensive and it might not be as profitable. So we need to find investors that are willing to take a lower return because it's going to do a lot more good. But those investors are a smaller population, and maybe it'll be harder to win 100 million from that type of investor. Who knows? It remains to be seen. But that's the work that we're doing at the moment, is pulling together some really integrated systems design that is sufficiently profitable to attract at least some investor types, and then go hunting for that type of investor, because investors are existing along a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, it's very, very high risk, high return. At the other end of the spectrum, that might be hedge funds. And at the other end of the spectrum, it might be lower risk, lower return, but much more conservative. An example of that might be pension funds. And in between might be philanthropic investors like high net worth individuals, billionaires, quite happy to spend 100 million looking after Hawke's Bay. And maybe they only are comfortable with only getting a 10% return on investment instead of 20 or 30. And it's finding those people in that landscape by putting up proposals and getting in amongst it to pitch those proposals to see if we can solve the problem.
Thank you for that explanation. In terms of the work that you do, it's highly stressful at times. Sometimes you go through various different projects, and sometimes you get wins, you don't, and sometimes you might get some losses. How do you keep yourself grounded? Is there any specific tactics that have helped you? And for the listeners, is there any tips that you will give in that space?
I learned a while ago that there's only so much that I can do in any given day. And I've also learned that if I don't get through everything, the police don't turn up. So I work solidly because I really enjoy my work, but I also balance it with family. So I'm not working late nighters and weekends. I used to work lots of weekends and used to do very late nights and get up and start work at 4 a.m. and I've done that. And as an entrepreneur, you typically need to be willing to do some of that. But it's hard on your body and hard on your family and hard on your mind. So I do what I can do in the course of a given day. I try to not take on too much so that I can do a good job with the things I'm doing, and to just try to work joyfully. And I think I don't know when I'm going to die, and I might have a heart condition and I might die next week. It's quite possible for all I know. And I don't want to spend this week so stressed out that I'm not enjoying this week and this day, because I'm working with staff, I've got a team around me, and I want to enjoy that. So, oftentimes I've had to make a decision. Do I want to disappoint a client by being late with this report, or do I want to disappoint my wife and my kids by being absent as a husband and father? And I choose my family over the client. And if the client is going to be upset about the report being 2 days overdue, that's not my problem. I mean, I'm going to endeavor to not be in that position, but those situations are always going to arise, even with best efforts. But I've decided to focus on who I care about and remember that the client is a business person. They're a business. It's just another day at the office for them. It's also, a similar thing with investors. I mean, if an investment doesn't work for the investor, like maybe the project doesn't work as planned and the returns aren't delivered as expected, well, the investor, if it's an investment firm, this is one investment among hundreds or thousands of investments that they're running, and many of them are going to fail. They expect many of them to fail, and if and when they fail, it's just another day at the office for them. And so I'm less stressed if things are not performing as I would like, because that's just the way of the world. And when I've had to report to a client, at one stage, one series of return projections I'd modelled were showing that actually they were going to be not as good as that, as the project. They'd already invested in the project. Then I was like, oh, I've learnt this. And they said, don't worry, just tell us. Tell us as soon as you know. They say forewarned is forearmed. We don't mind. Just tell us. And it was really empowering to know that I didn't need to worry, that problems always arise in business situations. And businesses, if they are mature, are going to just have good systems for dealing with the problems that do arise. And so that's been a useful thing to help me reduce my levels of stress and anxiety around performance, for example, because in the private sector, it's a fast-paced world. You typically need to work quite fast, and you're meeting deadlines that are much harsher in timing than what I experienced as an academic, for example. But to cope with that, we need to relax a little bit about not minding if you fail from time to time. Failing is fine. In fact, failing is a form of freedom. Yeah, it didn't work, and it's okay.
Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom. Finally, before we end, I just want to ask you, in terms of where you're going next, what is your biggest challenge and where are you heading? What's your project at the moment?
Thanks, Azura. The main challenge ahead right now is to try and use the last, I guess, 15 to 20 years of proof of concept, and then turn that into something that can cause good at scale, a bigger scale. So instead of a few thousand hectares, a few tens of thousands of hectares, and even eventually larger. That's the next challenge, and that's, in a way, that's the prize for having gone through the rough experience of proving concepts and pioneering things, to now go to start to manage the scale side of it. It comes with all of its own challenges, but to try and do that in a way which maintains its integrity and has really good systems and is well managed. And the type of projects to apply that to would be, as I described, regenerative forestry, but also biodiversity projects, because we've just built a biodiversity credits financing instrument at Ekos, and we've launched that just in the last month. And we are now needing to get out there and score lots of demand so that we can create lots of supply. The demand coming from organisations that want to cause good with their money, and supply being organisations that want to cause good with their muscles and be paid to do it, to build new wetlands and to protect forests and control invasive species and things like this. So that's the next stage of the journey. And part of that journey is getting my own organisation into a position where I can ease back and let the rest of the team run the whole company, rather than at the moment the team's running sort of half the company, and I need to step back again another step so that the others come through and can run things, and I can then play a steering role rather than pull back from leadership. So that'll give me more time to spend time on training and coaching people and mentoring people, as well as more time with my family and just not working as hard, because eventually I need to retire, even though I never think that I ever want to. The fact is the body wears out, and I'm going to need to angle more towards that. So in the coming 10 years, I'll be scaling things down so that I can go fishing.
Well, we certainly hope you will get to your fishing very soon. It sounds like you've got a very good, solid plan in place. You've shared so much of your story today, not only on your business side, but also on your personal journey, which has been very useful and a good reminder for all of us in this podcast. So I want to thank you for your time, Sean, and thank you for all that you're doing for not just your own business, but also for the community at large. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure, Azura. Thanks for reaching out, and really nice to have a chat like this.
Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation and got as much out of it as I did. As always, if this episode speaks to you, please like, share, and subscribe to Care Beyond Profits. I appreciate you, and until next time, keep caring beyond profits.